Welcome to Energy Unplugged, your go-to podcast for the global energy transition. I'm Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America, and our guest today is Mateo Jaramillo, founder and CEO of one of the most exciting long-duration storage companies in the world right now, Form Energy. He's had a stellar career, a BA from Harvard, MA from Yale. He serves on the board of the American Clean Power Association, and he's been deeply immersed in battery storage for the last 20 years, including a pioneering role at Tesla before moving on to found Form in 2017. Mateo, a very warm welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Oliver. It's great to be here.
I'm also joined by Zach Edelen, Senior Associate in our Austin office. Welcome, Zach.
Thanks, Oliver. Great to be here and great to meet you, Mateo.
So to kick us off, Mateo, could you perhaps give our listeners an introduction to what Form Energy actually does and what makes it so special?
Sure. First of all, I'm a co-founder of Form Energy. There are five of us, and I think it's important to note just because it really does embody the approach that we're taking in the market, which was to solve a problem first, and not to sort of show up with the technology and say, "Gee, how can we shove this into the market in some way?" And what's unique about all five of us in the battery space is that we've all been around for a while. So my career is 20 years, but actually, that duration is eclipsed by Yet-Ming Chang's, who's been in batteries for 30 years. So, we bring a wealth of experience to the idea of what Form Energy should be working on, which was, again, solving problems that we felt were not being addressed. And from the beginning, Billy, who's our CTO, Marco, who's our Chief Digital Officer, and then Ted, who's our Chief Operating Officer, we all wanted to solve a problem that we felt was not being addressed by lithium-ion in particular, because we also think that lithium-ion is a clear winner for sort of anything up to sort of daily cycling needs. But there's a really big unmet need for energy storage at the longer durations, and specifically in the minimum multi-day duration. And so that's what we started the company to address, and that's what we are doing with the first product that we'll bring to market, which is an iron-air battery. Iron-air is a chemistry that's been known for some time, going back about 50 years, pretty well understood, but it's never been commercialized. And the reason it's never been commercialized is there really was no product market fit. It has unique attributes to it. It doesn't work for consumer electronics. You can't put it in a laptop, much less a car. And so it sort of didn't really have a place to go. But for the current state of the grid, where we are today and where we're going quickly, it has a very important role to play, and primarily because it's very low cost capex. And there are some trade-offs associated with getting to that very low capex, but those are the right trade-offs to make. And the result is a very valuable asset that will play a valuable role on the grid. So that's what we are doing, is commercializing that battery to solve a problem that we saw as a big one that was just not being met. And we saw an entitlement for this technology to go do that. So that's where we are. We've been at this now for 7+ years. And we're about 800 people and cranking away. First customer delivery started at the end of this year, but I'm sure we'll get into more of that.
No, it's a phenomenal growth story, and with apologies to your four co-founders. I am curious though, what gave the five of you the courage to take the leap to found Form in the first instance? I know you're at Tesla at the time. As far as I understand, you're part of a pioneering team that was taking storage and applying it to stationary applications in the grid. I mean, that was in the early 2010s. That must have felt like, one of the most exciting things you could be doing in the energy transition at the time. What gave you the confidence and the courage and your conviction to drop that and go and start Form Energy?
Yeah, well, I had already left Tesla, to be clear. And I was there from 2009 through 2016. So a very compelling time to be there. When I joined, we were about 300 people. And by the time I left, it was 30,000. Of course, the company's now over 100,000, which is sort of, it's a little hard to fathom going back to sort of when I first joined the company. And I did go there to start the grid storage effort, which was not a thing back then. But it was very obvious to me that lithium ion should and would play a very large role on the electric grid. And that's why I went there. I'm not a gearhead. I don't turn wrenches under the hood. On the weekends, the vehicle application was not what captivated me. It was the grid storage application. And so that was essentially my nights and weekends job. I had a day job, which was on the powertrain business side of things. We had deals with Daimler and Toyota and others, and they were profitable for the company before before Tesla actually had the Model S, much less the, financial success of Model 3 and Y and everything else. And so it was an important piece of business for the company then. So that's what I did there. But I left after about 7 years because I really do like the earlier stage of things. And Tesla had a 30,000 person company, and you may have heard Tesla can be a unrelenting place for work, and it's fantastic. But I think that there was clearly something else there in the storage world for sure. And I also wanted sort of a different pace associated with it. If it's any indication for how challenging it can be to work at Tesla, being a co-founder and CEO of a startup company that's raised roughly $1 billion is an easier integration in my life than it was to be at Tesla. Tesla was very isolating in many ways, right? You're completely committed to the work, and Elon sets a pace which is just incredible. And it's amazing. But for me, 7 years was enough. And I wanted to sort of do something else. And so I left, but it turns out I'm not very good at thinking about much else other than energy storage on the grid. And so I kept coming back to sort of the other opportunities that I saw being unmet as I built out the stationary storage business there. And I talked to utility execs all the time, and the refrain over and over was, lithium ion is great. We're going to figure out how to deploy it in large volumes. That will happen soon enough, but it doesn't address one of the biggest challenges I have, which is this much longer duration challenge that I have. And if there's no storage solution there, then I'm essentially going to have two grids. I'm going to have a thermal grid for the reliability, and I'm going to have a renewable grid for the low cost. But in the end, it's going to be more expensive than maybe it needs to be, absent some, without some new approach there. So that's what I kept returning to. And I had, this idea to use iron air to address that. And I got a call from Yet-Ming Chang, who said, hey, I started this other effort. We're also thinking about the same challenge. Why don't we just all do it together? And he had identified a different technical approach, which was based in sulfur. But we identified a couple of different things because we just didn't know. You start down this journey, you really don't know. But what gave us the confidence to do it was the surety that there was value there. If you could come up with the right thing, there was unequivocal value in the system. You could deliver value to everybody, right? To the operator, to the ratepayer, to the legislators, like to absolutely every single stakeholder. If we were successful introducing this new type of asset, everybody benefits, like literally everybody. And so that's what gave us the confidence to jump in and say, we're going to go find a solution. And we also, when we characterized the chemistries that we were evaluating, we didn't see any sort of physics, electrochemical based reasons why one of these could not work, right? We couldn't say definitively, yeah, this is the straight and linear path to success. You just can't do that. But there was no clear sort of entitlement blocker, right? Iron air, even back in 2018 when we really first started, we just had to go do the work, right? There was a lot of things that we had to go learn along the way, but there was no fundamental blocker as far as we could see it. So it was a confidence that we knew the market was there. We strongly suspected that the tailwinds would start to be in our favor very quickly. Don't get me wrong. We had plenty of people say, oh, that idea is not going to be relevant for 20 or 30 years, right? Oh, we'll go from 2-hour batteries to 4-hour batteries, and then 6-hour batteries and 8-hour batteries, and it's all very incremental. But no, we saw that very clearly, and this is through deep quantitative expertise. We saw very clearly that there was value in this 100-hour space. And so all those things combined, right? The hard work that we did on the analytics side, the market feedback that we got from utility executives and from the other stakeholders, and then just sort of putting our gauge against what we thought was going to happen. We were pretty sure. In fact, I had zero doubts. I can't fully speak for my co-founders, but I can tell you for sure that we were all completely committed.
Excellent. I was sure it's really necessary also to push through on a project like that. So there's multiple, but two really important things you mentioned that I would love to get into, both the value side, but also perhaps to start off with, you mentioned multiple technologies essentially that you tried to explore, ending up with iron air. So maybe before we get further, could you maybe just in layman's terms give us an outline of how Form's iron air technology works and what distinguishes it in its properties that make it so much different from lithium ion?
Yeah, so iron air batteries, what they are essentially doing is rusting iron reversibly. So you're oxidizing, that's the rusting process, and then you're reducing, which is the unrusting process, iron many times. So that's the cycling. As far as what that actually means, what is the device itself? We have a plate of iron, and it's about a meter tall and about 30 centimeters wide and a couple centimeters deep, and it's porous, so it's not a solid plate of iron. And that porosity allows the reaction, that rusting reaction, to be happening through a lot of surface area inside of the iron anode itself. That anode is submerged in a liquid electrolyte, which is a potassium hydroxide. And then on the other side of it, you have an air cathode. And that air cathode, it's a bit of a different type of cathode than, let's say, what the lithium ion battery has. In our case, the active material, the oxygen, is not stored inside the battery, right? It's stored in the ambient air around us. And that means we need a way to get that oxygen into the battery, and that is through this cathode. So it's essentially a membrane, what's I guess more properly known as a gas diffusion electrode, a GDE. And so that electrode allows for gas to pass through and prevents liquid electrolyte from going in the other direction. In other words, it's performing a function like what Gore-Tex performs, right, in your jacket. However, there's a reaction that's happening in the middle of it, so it's a bit more sophisticated than just like a Gore-Tex membrane. So those are sort of the two sides of the battery. You have oxygen, which is coming through that membrane into the battery and oxidizing the iron on discharge, and then oxygen being what we say breathed out of the battery on charge as we are providing a current, which is driving off the oxygen from the rusted iron anode.
Awesome. Okay, thanks for that. And I imagine that's one of the things that makes it relatively cheap, right? Because I mean, iron is extremely abundant on Earth and probably one of the most, if not the most, mined material, and air is essentially free. And so neither of those are probably as expensive as, say, the lithium need for lithium-ion battery, although the membrane might add a bit of difficulty or a bit of cost.
Yeah, that's precisely right. That the active material cost is dramatically lower than really just about anything that's out there. As a point of comparison, our active materials are less than $1 per kilowatt hour compared to lithium ion, roughly $35 per kilowatt hour. So unprocessed active materials sitting on a table, right? And to just give you a rough sense for how that goes. The other reason why it is very low cost is because you can keep it low cost. So it doesn't do me any good if I have a low cost element that I then need to go synthesize in some fancy way, and it ends up being very expensive to get the performance I need. It turns out that we can keep it low cost while still getting the performance that we need. And in particular, the ratio of active to inactive materials is very high. In other words, I have a very large anode and a very large cathode and a lot of electrolyte. And as a result, the stuff around it ends up being a relatively small fraction of the overall battery. And think about a lithium ion battery. These are small devices, right? You hold them in your hand, and that means the ratio of active to inactive is actually low. And so for cost, you want your active materials to be as large a percentage of your system. You could even just go by weight, right, as possible. And so that's one of the benefits of the iron air battery. You can really drive that ratio in favorably in the direction that you want it to go.
Fantastic. So basically that covers one side, I think, of what you were really aiming for was a very cheap solution.
Mm-hmm.
And the other key thing you essentially stressed is the long duration aspect. And now cheap, carbon-free, and that long duration storage has sometimes been referred to as, you could say, the holy grail of the energy transition. So why would you say that is? What was the focus for the long duration aspect?
Well, I prefer something other than a holy grail. It puts maybe a little too much religious pressure on the device itself, and partially because I think there is no such thing as a holy grail or silver bullet, pick your analogy, because the grid almost by definition is built up from a diversity of assets. You have a portfolio of resources, and that's you should do that for a lot of reasons, for fuel diversity, and I mean that very broadly. For geographic diversity, for absolutely everything. To get your least cost, most reliable, safest system, having a portfolio approach makes a lot of sense. And that's including, by the way, distributed and centralized resources, right? So I think we need all of that to sort of show up in the right way. But this asset, this multi-day duration storage, is a really important piece to be covered. And it does drive down the cost of all the rest of the other stuff, right? And part of the reason it does that, if you to take the case where that asset does not exist, which is where we are today, right? So right now we do not have multi-day duration, cost-effective multi-day duration storage in the market. So what does that mean? It means that you are using as much lithium ion as you can, or something like it, right? To sort of put that in a general bucket. But to cover the inevitable periods of intermittency that show up in the multi-day duration space, and that could be a heat dome. Look, we're happen to be talking in July of 2024, and right now, city of Houston, there's still many people that are out from a hurricane that just went through, and they're now on their third day of outages, right? And so these weather patterns happen all over the world, regardless of where you are, and from hot or cold or wet or dry, it doesn't really matter. Heat domes or polar vortices or nor'easters or you name it. And so if you don't have multi-day duration storage to cover those periods of intermittencies, then you have to cover that some other way. You're either covering it through overbuilding essentially your renewables. So you have to, if you're only going to get 10% contribution from your wind, well, now you need to overbuild by 90% to get that 10% to be the productive part that you need, or same thing on solar, or same thing on hydro, whatever else it might be. Or you're running your thermal resources. And, the thermal resources are under a lot of pressure economically, right? Coal really is not economic throughout the country any longer, the US I'm talking about, and natural gas. And so, we can rely on the natural gas that's there, but there's also some challenges associated with that, including that it is susceptible to weather outages, right? So going back to the winter storm Uri in Texas a few years back, the natural gas pipes froze essentially, right? The gas was not able to be distributed, and that was the largest gap in terms of expected power output that drove the outages there. So we end up with an expensive overbuilt grid, is one way to say it. When you introduce cost-effective multi-day storage, however, you reduce the need to overbuild on all those other assets. So you can just have a more optimized type of portfolio. And this makes sense, right? If you sort of just, even without doing the very complex math, which my colleague Marco and his team have done, but even if you don't do it, and you say, well, take the grid prior to renewables showing up or storage showing up, what did that look like? We had coal, we had hydro, and we had natural gas. And we had two types of natural gas. And we still do, in fact. We have combined cycle natural gas, and we have essentially a simple cycle natural gas, right? So a jet engine strapped to a pad, more or less. And about in the US, about 300 gigawatts of each. Now, why do we have two very different types of natural gas assets? Because they're performing very different functions at very different cost and at very different efficiency points. But it turns out you optimize the overall system by having equivalent amounts of each. And so it's no surprise that for storage, you end up with a similar conclusion quantitatively, that you would want something like lithium ion, right? Relatively high efficiency, relatively high cost, doing a lot of daily cycling, and something like what we're putting out on the market, which is much lower cost, albeit at a lower efficiency. It's not zero, of course, but it is at a lower efficiency. And those two things are doing different things in the system, which allow you to co-optimize it, right? Because it's this really complex co-optimization challenge that you need to solve, again, through a diversity in a portfolio of resources that you've got. So with this type of asset, you just have a cheaper grid that's more reliable and more decarbonized and can meet the load growth options. It's a new asset class that just makes solving all the problems easier.
I think that's a good point around the role. So it'd be good to get into some of the details around the role you see Form playing specifically in the system. So it feels like there's a trade-off between cost and duration. So like you say, lithium-ion batteries are very good for daily cycling. If you're 1 to 2 hour battery in Texas, you're probably cycling every day. You've basically got 365 cycles over which to make the return that you need on capital investment. For long duration storage, maybe you're getting a really good spread if you're doing arbitrage on that first hour, but then by the 10th hour or the 20th hour, it's that starts to be very, very minimal. Take it all the way to an extreme, and you've got seasonal storage that's storing all of the excess solar in the summer and dispatching it the winter. You've got one cycle of which to make your return. So where is Form sitting in that duration and sort of cost matrix, and how did you decide that was the sweet spot for you to play in?
Yeah, so cost and duration are absolutely inversely and directly related for energy storage. And the application, the value for the application is not only in the arbitrage sort of world that you're talking about there, sort of taking a kilowatt hour. You have an energy market that has sort of hourly pricing or even sub-hourly pricing, and you're moving kilowatt hours between sort of low price and high price hours or periods. That is not what we are primarily going after. What we are primarily going after is as a capacity resource in the system. So, of course, the grid needs to be reliable, right? Now, today, more than ever, right? With all our devices and, the systems that we rely on electricity for. And so providing that reliability is one of the core functions of the electric system today. And you can provide it, again, through this diversity of resources, and you make sure you have your reserve margins, should you have, assets drop out. And this asset of 100 hours, which is our duration there, is really supporting that function. So in the portfolio of resources, it's not that this particular asset is valuable to the system because it's shifting energy around per se. It's that it is there when you need it for 4 days. Now, that's not the only thing it's doing because it is an asset. You want to sort of utilize any asset as much as you can. So it does other things, but the bulk of the value, and this is especially true for the customers with whom we've signed contracts. So these are integrated, regulated utilities in the United States. So unlike Texas, for example, which is an energy-only market, they don't pay for capacity right now. There's no central operator or planner for the grid, right? With these other utilities, they do that, right? They do have a responsibility to be the central planner and operator. And so they do put a pretty precise, it's internal, but pretty precise value on reliability. And so they can do that. They can run their internal market and they can say, I know how much I value this asset because it provides me specifically this amount of reliability in my system. And if I don't get it from there, I got to go get it from somewhere else. And I know how much I pay for that, right? And so that's sort of the key value of this duration that we have. And the 100 hours, it's also useful in other different ways. We do see that, for example, in periods of oversupply, and when I say periods, like weeks of oversupply, we see net charging, right? You're sort of absorbing excess energy, maybe for 4 hours at a time, but you're never providing additional discharge into the system because you already have too much. And in other periods, you're only net discharging because you don't want to add any incremental stress onto the grid by charging. So all you're doing is discharging for 20 days in a row, 4 hours at a time. And that's beneficial to the system overall. So you see that sort of seasonal, I would say, ratcheting without sort of saying, I'm taking 1 kilowatt hour of sun from the summer and moving that into the winter, right? And so we see participation in a lot of ways, but it's primarily around that capacity value. And then some of these sort of, other sort of intra-week, I would say, arbitrage that we do along the way.
That makes a lot of sense. And I suppose in a way, the only other technology we have right now that can compete in terms of providing that reliability value over multiple days is gas and probably OCGTs, because how cheap do you have to get to compete with a peaker in providing that need?
Yeah. So, as with any asset, they have a range of costs, of course. And what you're trying to figure out is how much value to provide to the system and what is the least cost alternative, which is sort of the threshold that utilities operate under, least cost systems. And so we need to be able to be competitive with that. But to be clear, we're providing a reliability resource, but also a decarbonized reliability resource. And so how do you put a value on that in particular? And so that's part of the question. Additionally, of course, the battery is not a generation resource. So how do you think about multi-day duration storage with the generation resource, which combined gives you the function, let's say, totally of a natural gas plant? And in that case, obviously, we're being combined generally with wind and solar. It's an electrical device, so it can be charged off of anything. But generally, that is the combination there. And so then what that means is you're looking for the total delivered cost out of your portfolio. In one case, let's say wind, solar, multi-day duration storage versus natural gas. And natural gas prices range pretty widely across the country, right? So natural gas in the Pacific Northwest is not the same as in Texas or Oklahoma or the Northeast, right? And so you sort of, there is a there's a lot of diversity in terms of the approach there for the different assets and what your least cost alternatives really do look like. We're not going to be competitive with, you know, a peaker plant, a gas plant in Texas. That's not really the market that we're going after, and that's not the constraints that we operate under. However, we're very competitive in other markets where there are gas constraints, either because of pipelines or because of mandates. And so we see those being, you know, sort of the very first markets that we'll get to. And we do expect to be sort of, you know, like for like competitive with natural gas in the longer run, but that's not where we need to be initially.
That makes sense. And when you're thinking about further cost declines, is the most potential is it in the technology itself, or is it in, you know, scaling up manufacturing efficiency, that side of things?
Yeah, it's all of it. It's scaling up the volume of manufacturing, of course. You know, there's Wright's curve. You're probably familiar with this from the solar industry, right? For every doubling of manufacturing capacity, you drop costs by roughly 20%. And that's true over just about every industry that's ever been studied. So we'll benefit from that as well. Also design improvements. And so, you know, simplification of manufacturing and, you know, reduction of part count and, you know, all these things, value engineering generally, as well as performance improvements. And the biggest lever that we have, of course, is to drive up performance and, you know, drive down cost at the same time. So this is one of the really fun parts. For a chemistry that's never been commercialized, we keep pushing the frontier out farther than what we thought it was initially, for performance in particular and for cost as a result. And so we've got the first generation design baked, and, you know, parts are coming in from suppliers who have been qualified, and, you know, the production processes are all being flushed out right now. And we already have a second generation design that we're working on, and a third generation design beyond that. And as well, a performance roadmap that we feel very, very good about. And so we see the cost floor being lower than what we originally thought it was, which is super exciting. And so I guess, generally very optimistic about sort of where we can take this technology from a cost perspective over a relatively short period of time, because now we get to really uncover the chemistry at this point. We know enough to really drive it super hard. So it's really fun.
Yeah, so that must be extremely satisfying, I suppose, to see how much further you can push it than you even thought. I'm curious, so we've talked a lot about the cost aspect, as well as actually pushing the envelope basically even further than you expected. Are you seeing something similar on the efficiency front, or is there perhaps a similar trade-off between cost and efficiency that you have to balance?
Yeah, there's always, you know, batteries are full of trade-offs. That's sort of inherent to a battery, right? It's like the balloon that you squeeze in one direction. You don't get everything, you know, all at the same time. So we always knew that this chemistry is a lower round trip efficient battery. You know, at the cell level, it's roughly 50%, and so that was one that we wanted to make. To tell you the truth, we knew that was the right economic trade-off to make. And we're not trying to force the chemistry to be something that it's not. Now, at the same time, and this is, by the way, borne out in the analytic work, in the, you know, work with our utility partners, right? This has been very deeply confirmed at this point. And we also see an opportunity to drive efficiency up over time. You know, it's never going to be a lithium ion level efficiency, to be clear, but we do see some room there. But we're always subjecting it to the scrutiny of, would I rather reduce cost or improve efficiency? And, you know, what's interesting is that in just about every case that we study, you always prefer to reduce cost versus improving efficiency versus where you are right now. So, you know, overridingly, the models say just drop cost, right? That's the valuable thing to do.
Makes a lot of sense, especially if you're providing that almost, I want to say, backup resource. If that's your main focus is the capacity play, then really you want the cheapest thing possible, especially if you're competing with a peaker, like a combustion turbine.
Yep, that's right. And you know, 100 hours obviously is a nice round number, and, you know, that's appealing to the human brain. But there are markets, and we pick one product to go out to market with because we need to focus on, you know, one SKU at a time as a brand new company. But there are markets that would prefer a longer duration, you know, 200. So take you know, Northern Europe, you know, lots of wind resources. The intermittencies there do tend to run longer. And so if you're going to drive deep decarbonization, let's say in the island of the UK, having more hours is beneficial at the same efficiency. And so you just really want to be driving that cost down relentlessly as much as you can to get the longer duration for some other markets, which would prefer that. And when I say longer, I mean like 200 hours, not 100 hours.
Yeah, it's really optimizing to the market itself and its needs.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Makes sense. And now, at the risk of jumping around a little bit, essentially, I want to get back to one thing you were discussing while we're still here, namely that question of essentially where you're deploying first and where you see the best opportunity for these batteries. So you mentioned that your main clients, if I've understood correctly, right now are you're really focusing on the integrated utilities.
That's correct.
Which across most of the U.S., except for Texas, basically have that capacity. So let's call it a capacity buffer obligation.
Yep.
That reserve margin obligation. Now, I'm interested why you focused on those as opposed to some of the numerous markets in the U.S. with actual capacity markets, something of PJM, New York ISO, ISO New England, and MISO in particular, where some of them, I think, especially, for example, New York could be a good example. Some of its zones have very high capacity clearing prices, as well as due to the state's decarbonization incentives, real needs for non-fossil fuel backup resources. So I'm curious why the focus on integrated utilities instead of some of these capacity market based markets.
Yeah, it's a good question. The current capacity markets are designed for much shorter duration. In fact, you can qualify fully for the capacity payment in some cases with a 1 hour battery. And you run just the sort of mental test on that. Could you actually run your system on 1 hour resources? The answer is no, right? But that's how the market has been designed. And it's a reflection of the fact that we don't pay for reliability today, right? Capacity as it's defined as a product in the wholesale market design is not a very good proxy for reliability, right? We call it, we sort of treat it a little bit differently. And in other markets, take California, what we call resource adequacy, same thing as capacity. It's a 4 hour product, and you can't run California on a 4 hour, 4 hour assets either. But that's how the market has been designed. And so what I'm pointing out is that there is not a market today that identifies a version of capacity that properly distinguishes between the value of something that is a 4 hour resources versus a 4 day resource. And we can agree that those are two very different things for the electric system, right? And so the markets are evolving. I think they'll get there in the end. And some of the terms of art here are like ELCC, effective load carrying capacities, right? How do you determine the value of any given asset when you really need it to show up, essentially? And so the ELCC of solar or wind today is actually quite low because you can't guarantee that's going to show up. And even if you add 4 hour batteries to it, you don't increase the ELCC very much, right? You do need something much longer than that to really drive that ELCC up. And we can get into, I know your audience is probably more educated than most, so we probably could get into the arcana of the design here, but maybe that's enough for now. Back to your question, that's one reason. The other reason is that the very first projects, inevitably first of a kind projects, are more expensive than where we expect to be, and so we do need to be able to sort of find the right partners that can lean into that. And the regulated entities have a mechanism to do exactly that kind of thing, right? Sort of pick the right size market project to demonstrate the technology, knowing that there is a cost curve that they will go down, and they can put that into their system effectively. Whereas if you're in a wholesale market, you're subject to sort of what happens when you need merchant funding for it, and so the cost of capital is very high, for example, to do that kind of thing. And as a new asset, it is not "quote unquote" bankable, right? And so the utilities, right? They have an obligation to bring this kind of thing into the market. In fact, they're being mandated to do so in many cases by their regulator. And so we are bringing a technology that they want to bring in, that they want to de-risk, and they want to come down the cost curve on. And those dynamics are just not there in the wholesale electric markets.
It's a great point, and I think it harkens back to what you said at the beginning. There's clearly value for multi-day long duration storage, but markets don't always reflect that in price signals, whether for capacity or something else. Maybe we could actually dip our toes into the minutiae of market design for just a minute. Are there things that you think could change in terms of market design features that you think could unlock the ability to roll out forms technology in competitive wholesale markets, or for the foreseeable future, is it just regulated markets that you're you're set to play in?
Yeah, so I absolutely. I think that the wholesale market design should be updated for a lot of reasons, right? But take the CLCC, whether it's that precisely or different approaches, I think everybody who's in the market does agree that something else is needed there to provide the right wholesale market signal to these different kinds of assets. So whether it's a clean, firm, product definition in the wholesale market, or it's a CLCC, or or whatever we want to come up with, we do need some different signal there. And so I'm fairly optimistic that it will come out. I mean, MISO they had a whole report called the reliability imperative, right? And that was sort of kicking off, what is needed to get to this kind of new market design that adequately compensates for reliability, which is essentially unpriced in the system today. And so that's probably the right way to think about it, is to say, okay, we don't have the legacy system that we originally designed the markets around. So how should we design the markets to not just reflect the reality of where we are today, but to send the right price signals to the market to get the grid that we know we're going to need in 10 or 20 years, right? Because these things do take time, and the proceedings will take 3 or 5 years, sort of in that range. In the meantime, we have plenty of business to do. Just as Form Energy is concerned, we have plenty of business with our regulated utility partners, and we're working actively with many other stakeholders, of course, to get those new market designs implemented here in the States as well as in Europe and Australia, all the places that are sort of taking a really hard look at their markets.
I think there's two more things I'd love to get into here, and one is basically I think basically what you're saying about moving first towards integrated utilities, partially because essentially you're in a pretty high up the cost curve at the moment still. And I think that speaks to the general phase I think you're in, the process you're in of going from startup to scale up. I think that's typically can often be a very difficult period to bridge for clean tech and actually for companies in general. Now you have your first manufacturing facility in West Virginia at the site of an old steel plant, which is under construction right now, and I believe actually is already outputting some first modules. So how are you thinking about that scaling up process and the challenges that entails?
Yeah, you said it exactly right. Going from startup to scale up, that is the challenge there. And indeed, we have our factory here in West Virginia. That's where I am right now. And we built the building over the last year. Construction is done. Basically, there's always things that we'll be working on, but it's a finished building. It's about 500,000 square feet, and we are doing those production trials that are producing those first modules that are initially going on to test, and then we're going to be doing deployments, internally controlled deployments, but out there in the market nonetheless over the next few months. So it is challenging, and you can be a company like Toyota or Tesla, who's been doing manufacturing now for a long time, and the very first factory or the very next factory, the first time you bring things up, it's always challenging, right? And so for a company that's doing that for the first time inside the company, that's extra challenging. How do we address that? We hire the right people is sort of the not so mysterious way that we tackle that challenge, right? Hire people who've done it before, and then set the right environment for them to succeed. So we have experienced manufacturing folks all over the place here, and construction folks and that kind of thing. And I'm super fortunate to be able to work alongside these true subject matter experts who know more about their craft than I ever will. So that's really the approach that we have taken from the beginning. And then we need to make sure that it's adapted correctly to our product, right? Because nobody has made iron air batteries before at scale, and so we are doing that for the first time. And we're making, as careful sort of decisions as we can about what we should be doing ourselves versus what is already available out there. Now, what we do really benefit from is that as it turns out, as we have learned, to manufacture these batteries at scale does not require bespoke manufacturing equipment. In other words, we don't have to, invent the machine to produce the thing that we need to go make. There are many off-the-shelf equipment vendors, indeed equipment sets themselves that are capable, within their process parameters of producing what we need. So we do really benefit from that, and it allows us to, with a relatively low risk path, bring up this manufacturing facility for the first time and produce high quality product for ourselves.
Great. I imagine that feeds in also to the many aspects you've chosen, or sort of that are in your favor for lowering costs. In fact, there are many things you can take off the shelf.
Exactly. So, furnaces and presses are extremely well understood and characterized, and you can get them at scale and that kind of thing. We use a lot of that kind of technology here, and that's because humans know a lot, have learned a lot about iron, right, and learn how to sort of process it in very low cost, high throughput ways.
We've spoken a good bit about gas and so natural gas and lithium ion as in some ways competitors, in some ways complements to long duration iron air storage. Now, in Europe, at least, some of the big buzz for the past few years, especially in the domain of long duration storage, has been around hydrogen. So I'm curious, looking forward, if you see any other major competitors on the horizon for long duration energy storage, for example, CCS or hydrogen, geothermal, maybe other battery chemistries you mentioned, or even just more transmission build out.
Yeah, I mean, I think of, as I said already, I think of the grid as a portfolio of resources, and there is no one single silver bullet asset that will solve all challenges. And so part of it will be dictated by geography. What are the other resources that are available to solve these same challenges? In the end, what we need to provide is a reliable, low cost, and increasingly decarbonized electric system. That's what we all need to solve. And the solution set will look different based on where you are. It will all come down to cost, is largely what it comes down to. And so part of the reason why hydrogen, I would say a bit off the bloom for the electric sector these days, green hydrogen is simply because of the costs that are now maybe a little bit more tangible than what they were 18 months ago when the latest sort of cycle was kicked off. And the numbers are coming in higher than expected, right? The dollar per kilogram of hydrogen, not to mention sort of how you get it to its end use location, they're just higher. And additionally, there's a lot of higher value than to use that green hydrogen molecule for electricity production. So, precursor materials for chemical processes or all sorts of other things, right? Much higher value, harder to decarbonize sort of sectors. So I see substitutes all over the place. I don't necessarily see competitors. And I also don't see our particular approach being crowded out entirely anywhere. So, and that's primarily because we'll never be able to go do all of what we would love to go do, i.e. build transmission. You could envision, a world that is completely, perfectly interconnected via high voltage DC cables everywhere. We're just never going to get there as much as I would like for us to be able to do that, right? Because it's always a summer afternoon somewhere in the world. And it would be lovely to be able to just move those electrons, around the world as needed. But that's just not a reality of sort of how we're going to see this electric system come together. So whether it's CCS or it's small modular nuclear reactors or it is transmission or it's something new, it will all come down to cost. And I think that the cost path that I see our technology being on versus some of the others, it will be in the hunt always, is sort of how I think about it. And whether it gets picked up specifically for some region or another, in the end, it doesn't really matter because we will have these diverse resource grids, right? That are comprised of different kinds of assets. And we're always going to want this option. Now, are there 1,000 different options that are getting selected between? Almost certainly not. I do think that there is a winnowing a bit of the options. So we need to stay competitive for the thing that we provide. But I think that this asset class as a whole is a durable one in the electric system.
So one of the ways we sometimes like to wrap up episodes is with a quick fire round of under or overrated. So I'm going to list a couple of things and you're going to tell me whether you think they are under or overrated, and you can explain a little bit if you like, but no pressure. So the first one is the potential for hydrogen in the power sector.
I would say overrated, especially maybe 6 months prior over the last year. But I think that, again, people's expectations have now come in line. So maybe it's sort of at the right place now, but historically overrated. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I would back you to beat hydrogen in the power sector. The second is the potential for a nuclear renaissance in the USA.
I would say it's about right, but the time scales are probably off. I think we should have another nuclear renaissance, but I think people are wildly off in terms of how quickly it will actually happen.
And finally, the potential for repeal of the IRA in the next 5 years?
I'm not sure over or under how to sort of say it. I don't think that will happen. Well, I should say wholesale repeal certainly will not happen. I think that like any bill, it will be modified over time, but it generally is going to stay intact because it is a successful bill, I would say, and in particular for a lot of regions across the country. So the beneficiaries are wide and deep, and I think that builds a constituency for the bill that is durable.
I think that's a nice optimistic note on which to end. Thank you so much, Mateo, for joining us. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Oliver. Thanks, Zach.
That was Oliver Kerr, Aurora's Managing Director for North America, talking to Mateo Jaramillo, founder and CEO of Form Energy. They were joined by Zach Edelen, Senior Associate in Aurora's Austin office. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.